Welcome back, it's Seth here. So just last month, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney flew out to China to discuss a new trade deal and to make an effort to improve Canada's relationships with China. This meeting wasn't just a normal meeting. This meeting was conducted to show Canada how its relationship with other countries is shifting. But at the same time, it almost seemed like Mark Carney was sending a message to other countries, and especially the US.
The world has changed much since that last visit. And I believe the progress that we have made in the partnership sets us up well for the new world order.
So by sending this message and signing a trade deal with China, this has become one of the most controversial trade deals that Canada has ever done. So in this video, I'll be explaining the details of this trade deal that Canada signed with China and why this trade deal is getting so much attention. However, before I dive deeper into this video, please hit the like button down below, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to help grow our channel. Now that you hit the like button, let's dive in. So to start off, what is this trade deal between China and Canada? Well, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney flew out to China in mid-January to meet with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to potentially strike a new trade deal. During this meeting, there were some discussions of issues that actually stem back to the government of Justin Trudeau. So one of the biggest areas of discussion were the tariffs that Canada had placed on Chinese EVs, the electric vehicles. Former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had placed a 100% tariff on these Chinese EVs back in August of 2024. This was part of a broader Western policy where Canada and many other Western countries believed that China was involved in unfair trade practices, as it's widely known that China will heavily subsidize its businesses so that they can build a product faster and much cheaper than other countries. So by placing these tariffs, Canada and the US were essentially protecting their auto sector from having cheap EVs just flood the market. But now Prime Minister Mark Carney did the complete opposite. Now with this new trade deal, Canada will allow China to send over 49,000 new EVs at a tariff rate of 6.1%, which has been dropped from 100%. Also, of these EVs that will be coming to Canada, it's expected that half of these will cost less than $35,000. So that means in the coming years, Canadians will have more options in terms of buying EVs. So individuals that were priced out from buying EVs, as most EVs are still quite expensive, now they will have a cheaper option to purchase an EV if they like. Now they could get into the EV market without spending $50, $60, or even $100,000. And now the second biggest part of this trade deal is the canola seed tariffs that China had placed on Canada. In March of 2025, China decided to place tariffs on Canadian canola, and these tariffs were almost up to 85% as a retaliatory tariff on Canadian farms and food exports. These heavy tariffs that were placed on canola had a huge impact on Canadian farmers, as their export of canola decreased substantially. China is one of the largest importers of Canadian canola. As these exports are worth billions of dollars, the Canadian government had a lot of pressure to come up with a deal to reduce these tariffs. And China knew that Canada wasn't happy with these high tariffs. So back in October 2025, China dropped a subtle hint. China voiced that they would be willing to take back the tariffs that they placed on canola if Canada scrapped the tariffs that they placed on the Chinese EVs. So in January 2026, that is the decision that Prime Minister Mark Carney made. Now with this trade deal in place, Canada can now unlock $3 billion in exports to China. And this is expected to increase by another 50% by the year 2030. Also by 2030, Prime Minister Mark Carney doesn't think these increases will just come from canola. The expectation this expanding trade will come from energy, clean technology, agricultural food, wood products, and manufacturing. Mark Carney also thinks that there's a potential that China may even manufacture these EVs in Canada in the near future. So those are all the details of the trade deal that was signed. And now let's discuss how this deal got so controversial. Well, to start off, the trip to China had everyone confused, as not too long ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney said in public that the biggest security threat to Canada is China.
What you perceive to be the biggest security threat to Canada right now. Mr. Carney?
Well, we're in a security section. I think we didn't have a chance to talk about anything internationally. I think the biggest security threat to Canada is China.
China, you say?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, he decides to pull on 180. This move was definitely raising some eyebrows. And what it didn't help at all was that it went viral when the public servants landed in China. They were informed that they should not be using their personal phones or their work phones. Rather, they should be using burner phones to communicate, in case that they were being spied on by the Chinese government. So to the general public and myself, this would make me really nervous that Canada is doing a deal with a country where I wouldn't even be comfortable using my own personal cell phone. However, when it came to light that Canada was dropping its tariff on Chinese EVs, this news spread like wildfire, and for obvious reasons. If you're not aware, the auto sector in Canada is very large. It employs over 500,000 people, produces over 1.4 billion cars, and generates over $16 billion in GDP. So this big concern was voiced by Ontario Premier Doug Ford.
And when you have the Chinese government wanting to dump cheap Chinese parts and cheap vehicles here, so I'm absolutely 100% dead against this. I have not talked to the Prime Minister. I will speak to him and tell him our concerns. And this is nothing against the folks in the canola business or soybean. We have a thriving soybean business here too. So it's not about them. I'm protecting Ontario, the 500,000 jobs in the auto sector. That's what I'm focused on.
Doug Ford goes on to talk about how these cheap Chinese EVs would damage the Ontario and Canadian auto sector, as most Canadians may be compelled to buy these cheap EVs over the EVs made domestically. And this could potentially result in these auto companies to leave Canada, which would result in job losses and a massive decrease to GDP. Doug Ford even went as far to tell Canadians to not buy these Chinese EVs. So with the trade deal, we may unlock $3 billion in exports, but the thinking is that this deal may do more damage, as the cheap EVs would flood the Canadian auto sector and destroy the companies that we've already built. And the reaction from the public was actually quite mixed. Some posting on X saying, "Looking forward to the positive outcome from Prime Minister Carney. I would be very much happy to try and possibly own a Chinese EV." While some others were posting, "1 out of 10 vehicles sold is an EV. You think we're going to buy Chinese spyware as a vehicle? You're out of your mind." I mean, it doesn't help when you tell your public servants that they can't use their personal phones and to use burner phones. So the public is bound to have some trust issues. But overall, the reaction to the EVs is quite mixed in Canada. Some people are for it and some people are against it. But now, last but not least, the loudest of the controversy came from our neighbor down south, the US. The response from President Trump was quite interesting. At first, he seemed to be okay with the deal.
Prime Minister Carney is in China. How do you see the deals, Canada and China? I've just signed trade deals between the two partners.
Well, that's okay. That's what he should be doing. I mean, it's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that.
Trump goes on to say that the deal's okay and that Prime Minister Mark Carney should be making these deals. However, soon after, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social saying that if Canada strikes a free trade deal agreement with China, he would place 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods. This message was a shockwave to all Canadians, as this keeps building on to the uncertainty of the future with our biggest trading partner, the US. So now that we know the details of the trade and the controversies regarding this trade, here are my thoughts on what I think about this trade deal. So first, it kind of seems like that Prime Minister Mark Carney pursued this deal to really help the Canadian farmers. The tariffs that were placed by China on Canadian canola were having a huge impact on Canadian farmers. So to help the farmers, the government had to find a solution. And the most obvious thing to do was to reverse the tariffs that Canada had placed on the Chinese EVs. Essentially, this trade deal in a nutshell is I scratch your back, you scratch mine. However, I do feel like there was a deeper message that Prime Minister Mark Carney was trying to send with this trade deal. Mark Carney was sending a message to the US that Canada is moving on with or without you. Hence why Carney said during the meeting,
for the new world order.
I personally think that Mark Carney is using this trade deal as a pressure tactic to bring US back to the table to talk about the ongoing tariffs and the upcoming review of the USMCA. Now, if I shift my focus to the EV part of the deal, to give you perspective, Canadians purchased over 264,000 vehicles that are zero emission in the year 2024. So these zero emission vehicles include EVs and hybrid vehicles. This new deal with China allows 49,000 new Chinese EVs to enter the Canadian marketplace. So currently, these Chinese EVs would make up around 19% of the marketplace. I personally would say 19% is quite high, and this could potentially destroy part of our auto sector. However, we have to look at the overall trends of how Canadians are going about purchasing zero-emission vehicles. So to give you perspective, back in 2020, the estimated amount of zero-emission vehicles that were sold were anywhere from 50,000 to 60,000 vehicles. However, if you fast forward to 2024, this has increased to over 264,000. So it's more than clear that every year that goes by, more and more Canadians are opting into buying zero-emission vehicles. So if this trend continues, that year over year, more Canadians buy zero-emission vehicles, and I do personally think that would be the case, as recently the federal government announced that they're bringing back rebates for zero-emission vehicles. The federal government will allow Canadians to get a rebate on zero-emission vehicles only from countries that Canada has a free trade agreement with. So China is not one of these countries. So overall, as the trends are already showing that more and more Canadians are buying EVs, and now the federal government's bringing back rebates, I personally think down the road, these Chinese EVs would maybe make up 10% or even less than 10% of the marketplace. So long term, I don't really think that these cheap EVs will have a huge impact on the Canadian auto sector. So overall, do I think this is an amazing deal or a terrible deal? To be honest, I personally think that it's an alright deal. This deal now allows Canada to have a better relationship with China by potentially having more exports by 2030. And I'm personally happy for our Canadian farmers now that they will be able to export their canola starting March 1st at a lower tariff rate. But I do think we need to be a bit realistic about this trade deal. We are being wishful thinking that China tomorrow will manufacture these EVs in Canada. The chances of that happening are probably slim, knowing that China does subsidize its businesses. So it'll be very hard for China to do that when they're manufacturing in Canada with the increased expenses. However, I think the bigger issue still needs to be addressed, and it doesn't seem like it's being addressed anytime soon. And that's the ongoing tariff issues between Canada and the US. The US is Canada's largest trading partner. Canada trades over 75% with the US. So it's more than important that we cut a fair deal for both of us, as most of Canada's GDP does come from the US. So until then, this deal allows Canada to export $3 billion and more by 2030, and I think we should take any exports that come our way with open arms. So this is my opinion on the trade deal, and I'd love to get to know your opinion down below in the comments below. So this is it for this video. Hopefully it gave you an overall idea of what this trade deal consists of, the controversies, and what we can look forward to. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please stay tuned for future videos, and until next time, remember to keep investing.